Welcome back to the Brewer Fanatic podcast. Jack Stern and Spencer Michaelis, your two co-hosts, coming back a little early this week due to scheduling reasons, but we still have quite a bit to talk about. A little bit of news that's become finalized, some takeaways from early in spring training so far. The Brewers signing a couple guys to minor league deals. We have some injury updates for you, and just a couple early developments that we've seen in camp so far. And then, as always, we'll take your questions. And Spencer will talk about the minor leagues, although looking at the outline here, it sounds like you have some not so great news on the minor league front, but we'll get to that at the end of the show. Before we begin, though,
Yeah,
how's it going, Spencer?
it's going well. It's going well. I am, like I said last week, everything baseball right now. So that's good. That's a good thing for me, but also busy. Definitely very busy at the moment. But yeah, we're fitting this in. I know you're going to be out of town the next few days or whatever you're doing. But we were able to fit it in Tuesday night. Luckily, no practice for us tonight on the coaching side of things, so that made it a lot easier. And yeah, I'm happy to be doing this. I'm happy to talk some actual Brewers baseball for the first time since early October. So going to get into the, to the extent that spring training baseball is actual Brewers baseball, but I'm counting it in this scenario. So yeah, looking forward to it, and overall doing pretty well.
Well, speaking of being busy, the Brewers a little bit busy on the transaction front, even though we are in spring training. Milwaukee's signing a couple of outfielders to minor league deals. Manuel, Margot, and Canha are now in Brewers camp after signing those minor league deals with big league invites. Not too much to go over here. Margot is almost certainly not making this roster. I don't really see any way he does. A
No.
guy who has largely had a reputation as a glove first player. You can correct me if I'm wrong here, but the bat was actually seen as having some potential in his prospect days, wasn't it? He was
Oh yeah.
pretty highly regarded at one point, but hasn't really hit in the big league. So I think that ship has kind of sailed as coming off an especially poor season with the Minnesota Twins. Oddly enough, like the thing that I kept seeing over on Brewer Fanatic's sister site, actually, Twins Daily, is how poorly he did as a pinch hitter last year. I think he only had was it
Yeah.
like one or two hits as a pinch hitter?
Yeah. It was like a 30 batting average or something when he went out there as a pinch hitter. You know what's funny? I remember one specific pinch hitting moment for him against the Brewers, and it was the first play that kind of made you just like it kind of like dropped your jaw when Joey Ortiz made the play. If you remember, he came in on a ball and bases loaded, and they had to go to review. It was challenged, but he ended up getting the out at first base, and that was Margot's, I think, first or second pinch hitting appearance of the season, and that must have been a sign of things to come for him because he just did not reach base as a pinch hitter. And yeah, Twins fans made it a bit of a meme as the season went on, I think, where they were probably not a meme that they loved, but something they noticed and talked about a lot was just, I don't even know why we're sending him up there as a pinch hitter at this point because he is not getting on base.
I looked up the line just to be safe. It wasn't 2 hits as a pinch hitter. It was 2 runs scored as a pinch hitter. He was hitless as a pinch hitter, drew 5 walks. So he was 0 for 30 as a pinch hitter in 2024.
That's
So now
impressive.
I can really see why there's a little bit of a stink made around the split. But either way, this is not a guy who I would anticipate getting big league innings, at least to start the year. I don't think he's breaking camp with them. The line for him last year, 238, 289, 337. That's a 76 OPS plus. His career OPS plus is 90. Hasn't hit for a couple of years now. It's depth.
Yeah.
And depth
Yeah.
is never
And
bad to have.
the defense kind of stepped back last year too.
Right, that's
As
what I
he's
was going
getting
to get to.
older, yeah, it's none of it's been great. The last year was just a really rough year for him, but like you said, it's the Brewers. I've talked about it a couple times on here and on other podcasts, but like the Brewers in the upper levels just really lack outfield depth in general. They have a lot of it at the major league level, but if you looked at AAA and AA, there were like a total of 4 or 5 outfielders for the majority of the offseason that were like sure things to start there. So this feels like somebody who can actually, at least hold his own at that level. He can be that deep, deep depth for the big league level if needed, but it's nothing more than that.
I think the one to pay a little bit more attention here, to here is Mark Canha. I think there's probably a pretty good chance that he does break camp with the Brewers. So when this signing first was reported, it was John Heyman who had the scoop first. And when I wrote it up, my takeaway right away in that write up was, yes, this helps the outfield depth. We'll get to Blake Perkins' injury in a little bit here after we talk about this. So you're in a spot where, yes, it doesn't hurt to have another corner outfielder. But to me, I was thinking this seems like it's just as much geared toward first base. And Pat Murphy telling Todd Rosiak of the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel after that signing became official that they are looking at Mark Canha primarily as a first baseman and then some DH time, pinch hitting, what have you. But outfield seems like it's not really at the forefront for where he's going to be hopefully helping this team out. And, we've talked plenty about third base on this show, just like I'm sure every kind of or every avenue, every lane of Brewers content has talked about, because that is the glaring question mark on the roster right now. But I don't think there's been enough focus on how going into spring training, like first base was not in a very good spot either. I think we had talked about it a little bit when Jake Bauers came back on a minor league deal. But Jake Bauers coming back on a minor league deal to me always felt like the Brewers kind of taking a look and seeing we don't have an actual first baseman on our 40-man roster. You have Rhys Hoskins, who's a first baseman in name only, and that he stands over there, but he's a terrible defender. Not to take away from what he's accomplished in his career on offense. That's his job, to go up there and hit dingers, not to go play plus defense at first base. But it's really bad defense at first base, not just in the standard, big guy, whatever, not great. He's a butcher over there. It's not good. Behind him, you had Tyler Black, who is also a bad first baseman, has not settled in at any single position on the infield, and after playing first base for almost an entire season, just did not settle into it at all. So I think that was a big driving factor in bringing Bauers back, because you needed somebody. If nothing panned out, if Black didn't develop a little more, if Hoskins still looks rough over there, even after hopefully having better, just lower body health, you needed somebody who you could at least put over there and be like, okay, he's a competent first baseman. I think this is where Mark Canha really comes in now, because the issue with Jake Bauers is always going to be, for as much as I've raved about what the ceiling looks like for him with the raw power and not chasing, there is just way too much swing and miss there, where we saw kind of what that floor looks like. He had a very up and down season, and he ended way, way, way down. Unless you want to go to like his final game of the year when he hit that big home run in the wild card series. So Mark Canha is kind of the opposite of that, in that he's not going to be very good, but you know what you're going to get with him. Even last year, when there's basically no power in that bat. He hit 7 home runs last year, and I know he was playing in Detroit and San Francisco, which are not hitters' ballparks, but he also just doesn't hit the ball that hard anymore. So like I don't think there's more power coming. I think people are a little skewed by the fact that he got, for this juncture of his career, abnormally hot down the stretch when the Brewers acquired him the last time. That's not happening this time. That's not really who he is. But he hit 240 last year, but his OBP was over 340. So he got on base at a solid clip, and he was essentially a league average hitter last year, especially when you adjust for the ballparks. That's really what you're getting here. Now you have a guy who, funnily enough, his primary position has never really been first base. He played there a lot as a rookie, then went mostly outfield, but went back to first a lot last year based on Detroit's needs, especially when Spencer Torkelson got sent down. But you have a guy who can competently handle first base. He's going to be better than Rhys Hoskins over there. He's going to be better than Tyler Black. And he's going to be a league average bat, most likely. The projections for him going into this year are exactly the same as where they've been for about the last 2 years now, where he's not going to hit for power, but he's going to get on base a lot because he makes good swing decisions. He'll work counts. He'll take the hit by pitch. I know that's your favorite.
Yeah.
I don't want to say, I mean, you call it a skill, getting hit by pitches, if you're getting hit that much and it's sustainably happening year over year. But that's really what's going on here. This is just, to me, it's a safety net number one at first base, and then also in the outfield with Perkins down. And you could probably put Margot also if you want in the category of maybe they needed some more depth with Perkins going down. But there's also a part of me, without knowing for sure, that's wondering like these deals are almost certainly in the works a few days before we hear about them. So I'm not sure they actually did sign Margot in response to Perkins. I wouldn't be surprised that was already something that they were working on. And it's
Yeah.
like you said, kind of going more of the AAA depth route. But Mark Canha is a very viable safety net at a couple different spots. I think there's a pretty good chance he makes it now over somebody like Jake Bauers, even though that does give you two right-handed first basemen. I think now this is something where the Brewers just are going to feel a little bit more stable at a couple of spots.
Yeah, agreed. I think the biggest thing is the stability that he brings. He's just consistent. Like I shouldn't say I hate, but something that kind of bothers me with baseball fans is how often we call like everybody streaky. Everyone is kind of streaky. It's like you are going to have a bad week or two during the middle of a 162 game season. You're going to have a really hot week or two usually during that stretch. But for the most part, Mark Canha is going to show up. He's going to get on base. He might poke a couple doubles. He might, pull one, hit one over the fence. Like you said, it's not going to be much power, but he's just going to give you good at bats. He's going to be serviceable or solid at first base especially compared to what the other options are, at least on the 40 man, like you said. And I think the other part of it is that he's been known as being a really good teammate. He's somebody that they like having in the clubhouse. The Brewers are very familiar with him in the clubhouse, so I'm sure that plays a role too, where they like bringing him back in terms of they know he's a good fit. They know all of that type of stuff too. So, the way Murph phrased that, and obviously this is a quote we're looking at on Twitter, but that the way he said it in terms of saying like the Brewers are looking at him as primarily a first baseman and a DH and a pinch hitter, that doesn't read like a guy who's going to go down to Nashville. That reads like a guy who's going to be on the roster and they're going to use him in those roles. Now, if things go terribly in spring or he just looks like he's not ready for the season, they have the option to put him in AAA most likely. There could be an opt-out. We don't really know what the opt-out dates are. But
there's almost certainly an opt-out here, like anytime a veteran signs this kind of deal.
Yeah, I'm just saying like it might be like a couple weeks into the minor league season, in case they want to send him there, let him get ready, get him built up a little bit more since he's technically coming to spring like a week late or whatever. But he's not going to be able to, they can't just send him down and keep him there all season. There's no way he has that in his contract. But depending when the opt-outs are or whatever, he's almost certainly going to make the opening day roster, I think. And I like it. I think it raises the floor. I like some of the moves that you can make that kind of raise the floor of the team. There are a lot of question marks with some of the young guys. A position like third base, like we've talked about a lot. I like a move on the margins that just kind of gives you a little bit more stability, floor raising, gives you just kind of a settling feeling when he's in there where you're like, he's going to do his job and he'll be fine. You need guys like that in parts of the roster. You can't build a roster around guys like that, but you can have you need guys like that in some parts of the roster. So I like the signing, and between the two, I think that's by far the one that's going to impact or be more important to the major league roster this year for the Brewers.
We mentioned briefly Blake Perkins' injury. We'll get to that and some other updates here. So Perkins fractured his shin last week, late last week actually, by fouling a ball off of it in BP. So Pat Murphy saying that he's going to be shut down for about 3 to 4 weeks, and then you're looking at a 4 to 6 week ramp up for him. Basically what that means is the earliest we're going to see him is May. I would guess probably later than that unless things really go well. Not a fatal blow to the Brewers by any means, but still this is kind of like one of your margin type player like you were just talking about. Like he's going to help you win on the margins, playing plus defense in center field, helps with roster flexibility a little bit by being a switch hitter, even though he is quite a bit better from the right side than from the left. This probably means you're probably looking at hopefully more playing time out of Garrett Mitchell if he's healthy. This is really a good runway for him. I was thinking, maybe this means more Sal Frelick in center field, but Jackson Chourio started in center field
Mm-hmm.
on Tuesday. So I wonder if this also means more center field time for Chourio as well. That's not something we ended up throwing in the agenda here, but I think that's kind of worth talking about as well. The fact that the Brewers are pushing him back to his natural position. I was on the fan in Milwaukee on Tuesday afternoon. I talked about it a little bit, but the I wonder if there are some people who are going to kind of wonder why this is happening or how Chourio projects in center because he looked a little bit shaky in the corners at times. For the most part, the speed and the range meant he graded out well, but the reads looked a little rough out there at times. And I actually would guess that he's probably going to be just as good, if not maybe even a little better in center. I'm
Yeah.
not sure exactly how the metrics are going to bear it out, but I think he's going to look more comfortable there because this is a guy who he started at shortstop when he was initially signed by the Brewers, but that was very brief. They moved him to the outfield really quickly. Played almost exclusively center field, and I think this is probably where the Brewers may have messed up in his development a little bit, that they didn't give him more reps in the corners, basically until he got to spring training last year. And it
Yep.
was very much a crash course. The reads were not good. I'm guessing that's why they played him so deep all the time too. I think it's gonna be pretty seamless for him to try to pick up going back up the middle again. It's probably gonna feel more natural to him. So, I am curious now how they feel about him, just his ability to slide over there now, because he is still probably going to be playing mostly in the corners. But the fact that they're bringing this option back has me wondering if they also wanna just keep Sal in right, like, permanently, just because of how good he was out there, but
Yeah.
I'm curious what your thoughts are on kind of the fact that Murphy has said they're gonna give him reps out there this year, at least in spring training.
Yeah, I think you nailed it. I think this is going to be something where he can just jump back into it and feel pretty comfortable. I said at the beginning of last year that I thought one of the biggest mistakes they made was that if you look at Frelick, Mitchell, Weimer, all of the outfielders who've come up. Now, I will say part of this is that they were playing together, so they had to kind of cross train them to make sure everybody was getting experience in center. But at the same time, they were cross training them at every position. All three of those guys were playing left, center, and right. Chourio, I believe, played 1 or 2 games of right in AAA when he got there. And remember, he spent like 10 games in AAA total before that was the end of the season. And then he got his extension and he made the big league club out of spring. And that's all he had in AAA. So he had basically never been in a corner. And they, I will say on the Guardians broadcast today, there were a lot of things that I thought were a little iffy. But one of the things they did talk about was that, when you're in center field, you're getting to see the ball kind of slice both ways, hook both ways. It kind of goes the way you expect it to. And in the corners, a lot of times, say right field, for example, a big lefty is going to top spin the ball because he's just taking his huge hacks, trying to hit homers to right. He's going to get top spin. Some are going to hook. Some are going to slice more the other way, even though they pulled it. And it's just not the same type of read that you get from the middle where everything kind of makes sense. If it's going to your left, it usually keeps going that way. If it's going to your right, it usually keeps going that way. And in the corners, that's not always the case. You also have to deal with the sidewalls, which I think is one of the things that when you're younger, you never have to deal with that. But in a big league stadium, those are kind of intimidating. They also throw off your line of sight. They have shadows over there. There's a lot of things you have to deal with in the corners that you never have in center field. So for him to go back to where he spent pretty much every game of his minor league career, I think it'll be a seamless transition. And I actually think now by the end of the season, he was pretty good in right field. Left was a little iffy. He didn't play a ton of left until the end of the season when they pretty much just said Sal's sticking in right. But even that, as he got more experience there, he became pretty solid out there too. I would anticipate, like, if he spent more time in center this year than the corners, or if he spent an equal amount of time in center this year compared to the corners last year, that he would grade out better in center than he did in the corners last year. And he was a good defender for the most part after some hiccups to start the year. So, yeah, I don't see any problem with it. I think it is something that when you look at it, you mentioned Frelick, I think they want him in right. I think the arm plays pretty well out there. Despite his size, he does have like an average or better arm for even a right fielder. He does have a pretty good arm. And he he was fantastic out there. Like he clearly has very, very good instincts in right field. And if you have a guy who's an elite defender in a spot, like we've talked about a lot with Terang this offseason, you don't really want to move him because why lessen that impact he can make on defense when you already have all these other really good options at these other spots? So yeah, I kind of anticipate seeing it now. Now, when Perkins is back, you might not really see it too much after that, especially if Mitchell and Perkins are able to stay healthy. But while Perkins is out, I would imagine some lefty starters on the mound. You'll probably see Churio in center a couple times, and even some righties, I'm sure too. But yeah, I think he'll handle it fine, and I do think we're going to see it almost for sure.
Final note on that too is Churio is the long-term center fielder out of this group. Just to make that clear, like he signed what is almost certainly going to become a 10-year contract because the Brewers, unless things go really poorly, are going to pick up those 2 option years on the end of it. So he's going to be around longer than Sal. He's going to be around longer than Mitchell or Perkins. He has that spot long term. So I think it doesn't hurt to try to already work him back in over there in his sophomore season. But Blake Perkins going to be out until at least May, like we said. A loss, but I think it's one the Brewers can pretty easily work around as well. That's kind of the luxury of having so many guys who are capable defensive outfielders running around out there, roaming the grass. Next injury update we have, again, is coming from Todd in Brewers camp. J.B. Bukowskis is going to have, in spring training already, season-ending surgery, essentially, because he's going to miss 9 or 10 months after he goes under the knife on his injured right lat. So basically right when Bukowskis reported to camp, there were already issues with the lat. Again, he's had multiple bouts with the lat, and it sounds to him like he's kind of hoping this is finally going to be something that resolves that issue. Quote he had from Todd was, "It sounds weird, but I'm excited. I can see the light at the end of the tunnel and finally get it fixed." So based on that quote too, it sounds like this is a guy who plans to continue pitching after this happens. One thing I was kind of talking with you about off the air, so to speak, was it does feel a little bit like he's like approaching a juncture where some guys do decide, hey, maybe this just isn't progressing the way I want it to. It's time to hang it up and move on to the next phase of my career, because he's, off the top of my head, I think he's 28. He's 27 or 28. I think entering his age 28 season. He's only got like 30 something innings in the big leagues in his career. Was successful in the very small sample with the Brewers, but again, small sample, dealing with multiple injuries like that. Some guys, when things play out like this, they do decide that they're just going to move on. But it sounds like he's going to come back and pitch again, but that's going to be a 2026 matter. I do wonder, though, if just the fact that there's basically like nothing to, there's going to be 2 years of nothing to speak of, basically not being on a mound at all. I do wonder if he just comes back on another minor league deal, just because, I mean, who else is he going to sign with at that point? But still a guy whose
Yeah.
stuff I really like quite a bit, the stuff that the Brewers are able to do with that sinker and with that slider. It's just always been a matter of health for him. So an unfortunate development. We'll kind of see where his career progresses from here.
Yeah. We've talked about it. We talked about it all season last year. Like we kept hoping he was going to come back because we thought he could be a pretty nice piece in the bullpen, and it never happened. And like you said, we had talked about it off of the podcast a couple of times where, you do start thinking like, oh, is he just going to have to hang him up at some point here if this doesn't get solved? But that quote is nice to hear just for his mental sake and everything. I think it's nice to hear that he's feeling good about it, that he feels like this might be the thing that he really needs to be able to start getting the career back on track, because I've dealt with injury stuff in my baseball career, but I haven't dealt with just constant injury stuff over the course of like a year and a half, like he basically has. And every time you get hurt, it puts a strain on your mentals. Like it's hard to get through it because you want to be out there. You want to be doing what you're good at, what your team wants you to do, you just want to help the team. And the longer it drags on, it just gets harder and harder, and it's more frustrating. And so for him to feel like there's an actual solution to this, I'm sure that's a bit of a weight off his shoulders. It does make me wonder a little bit, like, I wonder if he had the choice to try and go through another offseason where he was attacking it with just rehab and everything, or if he had the option to do the surgery earlier. And it's his choice, obviously, in that case. But um, I always wonder about those things. Like, I wonder if he thinks back and goes, oh, I should have just bit the bullet, got the surgery, and then maybe, back mid-season or something instead. But that's the choices they have to make, and the doctors have to make, and everybody else. So, yeah, either way, I'm happy for him because he sounds happy about this kind of, not in a, I'm sure he'd rather be pitching, obviously, but in terms of the options, he kind of sees a light at the end of the tunnel, like you said. And I think that's always important for athletes to be able to at least have some positive when stuff like this happens.
More of a minor injury update coming from Adam McCalvey. Tyler Black has not played in a spring training game yet. That's been because he reported to camp with some minor back stiffness, but sounds like it shouldn't be anything major there, and we should be seeing him soon. Spring training highlights. Highlights is in quotes on our outline here because it only has been 4 games. So there's really only so much you can talk about. Before we dive in here, almost everything you're going to hear us talk about related to actual on-field spring training stuff in games, it's almost all process-based. So we're going to be talking about Arsenal stuff, how do Arsenals look. When we talk about Vinny Capra, we'll get to some bat speed stuff, swing path, things of that nature, because that's really all you can glean from spring training. You should pay absolutely no attention to any of the results because they don't matter. It's spring training. Every year there's always the guy, too, who comes in and he hits the cover off the ball in spring training, and then you get to the regular season, and the magic's gone. It's just kind of a good way to exemplify what the preseason is all about. But we'll kind of dive into a couple of process-based things here. We'll start with Logan Henderson, who made his Cactus League debut a couple days ago. And the big thing to note here is that he was sitting 94 to 95. Did he touch 96 once? Or was it like
I
a
think if you round up,
94?
I think if
If
you
you
round
round
up,
up,
you
well,
get 96, yeah.
I don't know if we should round up or not. I feel like we're giving him undue
The
credit.
gun on the
But
screen would have.
the bottom line is this is a couple ticks up from where he's usually been. He's usually been around 91 to 93 maybe with that fastball, or 92,
Yeah.
usually in that range. And the fastball's been plenty effective in that realm because, number one, it plays well off the changeup. Number two, he's a short guy who actually gets pretty decent vert from a lowish slot. He's at like 17 vert, and the release height is not very high at all. So he's gotten a lot of swing and miss up in the zone with that pitch. Not a super tall guy, and he kind of throws a little more lowish 3/4. But now you add a couple extra ticks of velo into the mix, and things really start to get interesting. He also just in general showed a more expanded arsenal from what we've seen before. So it's always been the fastball and the changeup, but if he can get a more consistent glove side mover into the mix, again, that also makes things a little bit more interesting. So that brings us to our first question that we're going to take in this episode. To Ginger, again, what a username. He asks, thoughts on Logan Henderson either adding a cutter or slider, and what is his realistic outcome if those turn out to be average pitches? So, Spencer, I've already dipped into your territory a little bit talking about a prospect. I'll let you take it away here.
Yeah. So it's a good question because this has kind of always been the question with him. At the start of last year, which he started a little late, he had an oblique thing that he actually got hurt during the minor league warm up or whatever they're calling. I can't remember what that is called, prospect warm up or something. I can't remember. But the big game where it was all Brewers prospects against Royals prospects, I believe it was last year. He hurt
For
himself
some
in
reason,
that.
I
So he
can't
started.
remember the name of it either.
Yeah, I can't remember what it is. I actually like it. I think it's a really good idea. I know they're doing it again this year, so I'm excited for that. But that's when he got hurt. So he came back in, I believe, early May, and he was throwing sliders when he came back. Now, would I say it was a good slider? No, but I wouldn't say it was a terrible slider either. I think there was a decent profile to it. Now, I didn't have numbers for it, but he was getting some chase from it. He was able to land it for strikes. And then a month or so into the season, he just stopped throwing it. And I never heard why. And then all of a sudden he started throwing a cutter more often, which he had mixed in a couple times early in the season as well. but he started throwing the cutter more often when he got to Biloxi. And again, I wouldn't say great cutter by any means, but it's a different look, and it is something that has a little bit of glove side. It is something that just changes the way hitters have to see your stuff. And it's not a great pitch on its own, but we talk about it a lot with the Brewers. If you can kind of mirror it with the good pitches and just use it as a pitch to at least keep hitters off of the two, I would say the changeup's a really good pitch. And I think the fastball, you talked about the release height and the vert. And I mean, that combines for like a negative 3.8 vertical approach angle, which is big time outlier stuff. Like that's -4
That's
is
better
usually
than Freddie Peralta. That's quite a
yes,
bit better than Freddie Peralta, and Freddie Peralta is always the guy who kinda gets, the props for having that kind of fastball.
right. So like I actually think the fastball's always been a bit underrated. And now if he does, have an extra tick or two, it's just an even better pitch. But something going the other direction. And I would say, even if you throw both the cutter and the slider like he did in his inning, and neither of them are very good, but it is two different things that go the other direction. I do think there's merit to that. You don't need to use them a lot. You don't need it to be a big, big part of your repertoire. But I think throwing them out there and at least having hitters have to keep that in the back of their mind when you're going to have a fastball that'll pop right by him with, he's got pretty good extension for his size too. Um, so fastball will get on you a little bit. And then you've got this changeup that he takes pretty close to like 11, 12, 13 miles per hour off of at times with pretty nice fade to it. Those other two pitches just need to do enough to complement those and to make hitters and to keep hitters from just being able to sit on one or the other. I think that's all he needs here. I think there's been an element of maybe not trusting them in games from what I've seen, like where he just doesn't, even early in the season, I would pay close attention to his starts where I was like watching signs even to try and see what they were calling. And he was shaking some of the ones that were breaking balls. So to me, I think there's always been an element of like, this thing isn't that good and I don't want to throw it because I don't trust it like the other pitches. So maybe there's this element of, he just needs to get through that and say, it doesn't need to be that good on its own. It's what it does for the other pitches that are really good that makes it valuable. So if they become average, like he's asking in the question, if even one of them turns into an average pitch, I think that to me, that basically would solidify my thoughts that he is a starter. I think if neither of them get to that point, then maybe you're looking at him as more of like, there's actually a bit of a Devin Williams type of profile here. If you don't get to that point, not the same type. He doesn't have like he does not get as much drop on the changeup. It's not as big of a mover, but it is a fastball that rides and has a lot of carry and can get into those mid 90s. And then a changeup that has a ton of velo difference. Like you could see that playing in a pretty decent roll out of the pen without anything moving glove side. But if he is going to start, which I do think he's capable of because he's held velo in games and stuff too, he does need something going that direction. And if he can get one of those to be an average pitch, then I do think he's a starter. And I think he's probably a solid one who can hold down a back or maybe even middle of a decent rotation spot, because I think you've got two borderline plus-ish pitches and you can build around that. It can't be just those two in a starting role. So it's always been the question. It's a good question. I'm really hoping we see some strides from him early this season. I think if we do see those strides early on in AAA, we see Logan Henderson relatively early this year. I think he might be one of the earlier call-ups if that does happen, because he's on the 40-man. He's got the stuff in those top two. We just need to see if he can get that third one going, and he could be up pretty early and helping the Brewers, I think, this year.
Sticking on the velo gains front, Brian Hudson made his spring training debut at Goodyear Stadium against the Guardians. Unfortunately, we already have a limited enough selection of StatCast games on the spring training schedule, and to make matters even better, the StatCast system at Goodyear was all over the place. Basically, we were on stretches of it would read 2 to 4 pitches in a row and then go dead for like anywhere from 5 to 15 pitches at a time. Unfortunately, Brian Hudson was basically caught in a stretch where it like went on its longest run of not reading anything. And then immediately when we got to the next half inning, Vince Velasquez was on the mound, and it read like every single one of his pitches because, of course. But it did read his first fastball of the inning, and it was 93.9 miles an hour. His first sweeper that he threw, which was also in that bat, StatCast marked it as a cutter because the StatCast pitch classifier is hot garbage. I'm still not sure how they haven't made that better for as good as the rest of the technology is.
No.
But the sweeper, the first one at least that he threw that we have a reading for, was 84.2. And I'm not going to rehash the whole Brian Hudson thing again. You can go back and listen to those episodes because we talked about it at length because I think a lot of people were confused what was going on, and the Brewers weren't super transparent with people about why he was being sent down, although I tried to ask about it a little more and get some more concrete detail. Like I think we both figured it out pretty well ourselves, but it would have been nice to get a little more explanation from them.
Yeah.
Basically, the changes were as the season went on, by the time the Brewers sent him down and never brought him back, his fastball was averaging 89 miles an hour and his sweeper was all the way down to 78. So basically, the velo on the fastball was gone and the sweeper had lost it was like 6 miles an hour on average, which that radically transforms that pitch. That made it really loopy, even if the actual induced movement was the same. And it never got better in AAA, so he never came back. To see him now in his first spring training outing hitting 93.9 or 94 if we want to round up, and then 84 with the breaking ball, that's like you're talking back to like peak Brian Hudson. So again, we need more of a sample to know that he's actually maintaining that, but to see him even hit that like once on each of those pitches in his first outing, it's a sign that he's healthy. It's a sign that everything is hopefully kind of reset. Everything looks good. He had a good outing. Trying to remember, I don't have the box score in front of me. Did he strike out 2 or did he strike out the side?
I think it was 2. I'll pull it up.
I think it was. That's fine though. We don't. The point remains. We just talked about how we're not going to look too much in results. We're going to look more at process stuff, and this is what we're talking about. So good to see the velo for him. If that's where it should be, I would be shocked if he's not in the opening day bullpen. This is almost certainly what the Brewers have been waiting to see. We saw a glimpse of it finally for the first time in months. Hopefully it holds that way, and hopefully the Brewers have kind of a plan in mind for keeping him healthy throughout the entire season. So we did mention we're going to talk about Vinny Capper briefly. We actually talked about Vinny Capper last week as well when we were talking about some roster stuff, and I said that he's almost certainly going to make the opening day roster because he's out of options. Well, conveniently, Vinny Capper became a headline right away over the weekend to kick off spring training. In the Brewers Cactus League opener, he hit 2 home runs, including a walk-off 3-run homer, 6 RBIs for him. He's not a power hitter. This doesn't mean he's magically a power hitter. I really don't even care that he hit 2 home runs because, again, it's spring training. But it was interesting to hear him talk about how he spent his offseason training bat speed, so trying to swing harder. Again, that's not going to transform a guy like magically from, slap hitter, which he's always been. He's only gotten to double-digit home runs once in his professional career, and that was back in 2021. He's not going to, transform into a power hitter now, but you could get a little nudge from that if he picked up, say like 2 miles an hour bat speed or something, because that's what Monasterio did from one year to the next. It helped him hit the ball harder, but everything else kind of got worse. But in Vinny Capper's case, I think he's going to be on that roster just by virtue of being out of options. He'll be the utility guy to start the year. So it never hurts to see him get off to a hot start as he's trying to make his bid for that spot. But I do think he's someone we're going to see break camp. The 2 home runs I don't think are going to influence that nearly as much as, you'd like to drum the storylines up. But still good to see some production from him early on. Oliver Dunn has also flashed a little bit of power early. Again, not going to go into that too much. We've talked about that profile plenty. We know the power's there. It's just a matter of can he make contact against big league pitching in big league games. We'll stick on the hitting side. Cooper Pratt hitting a 3-run double and then adding another double. He got a start at shortstop on Tuesday, so good to see him producing. Another guy who very toolsy, has the potential to be a fully well-rounded player.
Yeah.
An exciting guy to watch as he keeps rising up through the system. And then the last thing we'll touch on so far, Jacob Mizorowski. He got the start on Tuesday as well. It was bumpy. In a lot of ways, it was essentially the Jacob Mizorowski experience in which the stuff was electric, but strikes were fleeting. It's probably the easiest way to put it. A few walks in the first inning that really got him in trouble. But again, nothing new there. Just a matter of can he control the stuff? I still don't think he pans out as a starter. I think the Josh Hader relief type role is where he's ticketed. But the Brewers are going to try to have him start again this year, and I don't blame them. You have the time to keep working at it. Why wouldn't you? It's not like there's an urgent need in the bullpen. That's why they had him preparing in relief down the stretch last year, just in case that need popped up. But it never did, so they never had to call on him or Craig Yoho. So now Mizorowski getting a chance to start again. Nate asked us before the game to take notes on Miz. That's really all that I have. Is there anything else that stood out to you from his brief start?
Yeah, so I will say with the command, I've watched a lot of Jacob Mizorowski. He did walk 3. I actually think generally he was pretty around the zone. Now, Cleveland has some very patient and very good eyes at the top of that order with Jose Ramirez and Carlos Santana and guys like that who just they know their zone very well. Lane Thomas challenged a pitch that was less than half of an inch above the zone that was called a strike against him. The thing I noticed most is that while he's still a complete string bean of a human being, I do think he put on a little weight, a little mass. He looks a little bit bigger to me. And the delivery actually looked a decent amount more in control than I saw it last year. There was a lot less like flying off of the mound. He seemed a lot sturdier when he landed. And for the most part, like I said, the fastballs were very much around the zone. Now, he's going to have to throw them in the zone if he's going to be able to handle things at the big league level. But I actually thought, and he kind of talked about this. I saw an interview that Todd Rosiak had posted of him talking about it, and he said he felt like he was actually, for the most part, pretty around where he wanted to be with his spots, and it was just a lot of near misses. I think the breaking balls, he had a couple where they got away from him a little bit more, but I don't think any of the fastballs were more than, a couple inches maybe out of the zone. And again, that's not going to be good enough for the big league level, but I do think it matters in terms of where I'm looking at him for development. I've watched him a lot. Like I said, almost every inning I've watched of him, he will sail a fastball, and there will be a fastball that's not all that close because he just completely fell out of his mechanics. The fact that everything was relatively in the area of where the targets were, there were a lot of pretty near misses. I think there were even some that were in the zone that the Brewers could have challenged, I thought, when I was watching them. I was a little surprised on a couple of them that, granted, one of them was dropped by Haas, so that might have been why he didn't feel good enough to challenge it. But overall, I actually came away from it feeling a little bit better than I know what the line score shows. It doesn't look like that at all. But I actually thought I saw some things that are going to translate into some better command as we head through spring and then hopefully into the season where he is going to start in AAA. He's going to be a starter to start the year, and we'll find out what happens from there. But I saw some good things, and like I said, the box score does not show that. It could have looked a lot better too. Bowers had a not super easy play to make, but a play that I think he would probably tell you he should have made so the 2 runs wouldn't score. But either way, it would have been 3 walks regardless. It just overall, I actually felt pretty decent watching him. And I agree with you. I still don't feel very confident that he's going to be a starter. But I would actually say I feel slightly more confident than I did before this because I do think there's been some improvement in the body and in the mechanics from last year. And I mean, that matters. It's going to keep happening as he continues to mature. The Cleveland broadcast pointed out numerous times he's 22 years old. He was a 1-year JUCO guy. So it's not much more than like a high school pick. And a guy who's kind of flown through the system, gotten to AAA already after in his second full season. I think there were dreams of like this immediately turning into like, oh, this could be like Jacob deGrom with this type of stuff when you're looking at it when he gets drafted. So now people are getting a little impatient. Now, again, it's going to depend on if the Brewers see so much value in, like you said, the Hader role where it just doesn't matter. And they just say, you know what, screw it. We're just going to completely give up on that starter dream because he could already bring us a ton of value in the bullpen. And that's worth giving up on that. But if they're willing to give him a decent chunk of this year and see how it plays out, I would not be totally surprised if it looks a lot closer than it did at the end of last year. And you start seeing like a clearer path to it, because I really do think that there was some solid changes this year. And I know a couple other people who have watched them a lot. I was texting with earlier today kind of agreed with that. They're like, it looked cleaner. So we'll see. But overall, I actually came away more enthused than than I think most people would, just having watched it, because I did see some actual tangible change to what he's done in the past.
You should write about that.
Yeah, I'll try and find the time for that, Jack.
Maybe it'll get done in 14 to 17 business days. But we'll move on to some listener questions now for this week. We'll start with Dave, who asks us, kind of circling back to the Blake Perkins injury. Does Perkins' injury open the door for more Ernesto Martinez? Or, excuse me, does the Perkins injury open the door more for Ernesto Martinez making the opening day roster? I almost read that as more Ernesto Martinez making the opening day roster. We're cloning Ernesto Martinez now. But he said, I know he spent time in the outfield before. I'm going to say probably not, just because there is still enough depth there. And for as promising as Ernesto is, like, I think there's almost to an extent so much hype around them that people kind of keep forgetting there are still quite a few people ahead of him on the depth chart.
Yes.
Like it is going to take a lot for him to make the opening day roster. And Blake Perkins being out until the start of May, at least, maybe a little longer, that's not major enough to swing the calculus that heavily.
Yeah. And we talked about it last time. We thought it would take probably a Tyler Black and a Jake Bauers injury. Now you've added Mark Canha into the fold as a first base option. Like, I don't think it changes anything for Ernesto. I think he has to go to AAA and perform and show that he deserves to be there. And then he still probably is going to need someone to either really underperform or have some injuries at the big league level for him to make it up this year. But Ernesto's a very fun guy. He's a guy that I think, especially having seen some interviews, and I'm sure other people have seen the interviews now, like, he's somebody that you want to root for sure. But like Jack said, I think we got to keep in mind there is quite a bit of depth ahead of him right now, including a lot of guys who are on the 40 man, who that they're always going to have even a talent either way. Like, if it's even close, it's going to go to the guy who's on the 40 man. So yeah, there's still a lot of stuff in the way, I think, of him really making the opening day roster, especially.
Steven asked us about the infield alignments so far. The Brewers opened spring with a third base, shortstop, second base configuration of Durbin, Ortiz, Terang. So Caleb Durbin at third, Ortiz at short, Terang at second. Murphy said not to read into it, though. Are there any positional setups you would read into? Examples including Tyler Black in the outfield or at third base, Sal Frelick in the infield, or Churio in center field. And then Henry had a follow-up comment to kind of tack onto that question. Rocky's broadcast said Durbin had been confirmed by Murphy as the de facto Adames replacement. TBD on second base or third base, which spot maximizes defensive value. I'll start with the first question, I guess. Generally, you're going to see Bryce Terang for sure play second base and shortstop. I'm not going to read too much into that till we get closer to the end, but I am curious if we're going to see Durbin play a lot of third base early on, because the Brewers have not like fully come out and said it, but they've kind of hinted at it or danced around it that they want Joey Ortiz to play shortstop. And for Joey Ortiz to play shortstop, Caleb Durbin has to play third base because Bryce Terang just does not have the arm to play third base. It's also a waste of how much range he has compared to how good he is at second base. So I'm curious to see if they're going to give Durbin just a lot of runtime at third to start out the year, because they know he can play second base. That's the position he's played predominantly in the minor leagues. They have plenty of scouting info, plenty of video, plenty of data on that. I think they're going to want to get an up-close look at him at third base as much as possible to see if he can play there and if that does make for their best defensive alignment. So I would say as a whole, like the way he's got that lined up, I can see what he's saying when he says not to read into it. But if Caleb Durbin is playing a lot of third base, like that's even early, that's going to set off a pretty clear sign to me that like this is how the Brewers want it to be, and they're going to
Yes.
see if that can work.
Yeah. Agreed. I would completely echo that. I think it's not really I think it would clearly show that this is their preference if that's what they're doing. If we see a lot of Durbin there, and then they would pivot if they have to, I think. But just on the other ones, like some of the examples, I think we already talked about Churion center, and then obviously Murph. This question was asked before any of this happened, before Churio played in center, before Murph talked about it. So good call out on that because it happened the next day. But Churio in center, we talked about like, yeah, I think that matters because now they're giving him a look there. I don't think Sal on the infield would change much for me just for that example. I think it's more they would still be trying to see if they have any versatility that they could potentially use if they're in a pinch or if it makes a ton of sense in a weird game or something. I do think the one thing that I would have found pretty newsworthy is if they had put Tyler Black at third and played him a decent amount there this spring, because Mark Ananasio had mentioned that in his press conference. Murph kind of came out and said, no, we're looking at him more at first base. But if they had done that, that would have been a sign to me that like they're considering him as a legitimate option here too, amongst, the Dunns, the Durbins, the Monasterios. The fact that they're not, I don't think there's much, even if he went over there for a game or two, I would not read much into that. I think the main thing here is that if you're reading into any of these things, it should be because it's happening a lot. That's probably the takeaway for like positional stuff. If you see a guy in a certain spot a lot, that's when it's probably something that's worth taking note of. And then, yeah, on the other part, the Henry question, we talked about that a lot last week, but that is the question. I think we don't know yet which one is going to be best, but I think that's going to be one of the biggest things the Brewers are trying to answer this spring. It's probably the most notable storyline, honestly, at least in terms of like lineup and roster construction. Obviously, there are player specific storylines, but how they're going to line up the infield, I think, is something we're going to find out. We don't know enough yet, and I don't think the Brewers do either. So we will hopefully know in about a month.
Bobby asks us, how much time does Christian Yelich spend at DH this year? It may seem logical to have him spend a lot of time there, but until we hear otherwise from Murphy and or Yelich, I think he's in the outfield like usual, with maybe a few more DH appearances, especially early, to try to keep him healthier and ease him back in. I'm going to say, and I'm going to put this relative to Yelich's total playing time, not actual split for every single Brewers lineup. I think I'm going to say, like, at this point, 60-40 DH to outfield. I do think he's going to DH a little bit more than he plays the field, but I don't think he's going to be a full-time DH by any means because the Brewers like to have that flexibility of being able to rotate some guys through there. But I think in most situations, if everybody's healthy, it just makes the most sense to put Yelich there. I think in a perfect world, you could get Rhys Hoskins off the field. But again, when the backup is Mark Canha, I don't think Mark Canha is going to be pounding on the door to get into the lineup. I think he fits way better as kind of that bench piece, and you can put him in at first late for defense a little bit after Hoskins has already batted 2 or 3 times in a close game when you have a late lead. So I think that just naturally means it's probably either going to be Yelich's DHing a lot of days, Contreras will DH a lot of days. You will get some Hoskins in there to get him off his feet. Maybe Mitchell DHs a little bit, and those could be the Churion center days. Kind of like a rotating carousel, but I would guess that Yelich takes up more DH time than anybody else. And I think that, especially if the other outfielders stay healthy, if you don't have any more flies dropping there, that's obviously going to change everything if something happens on that front. But if you have good health out there, I think it's going to be a little bit more DH time for him than you're going to see in the field because that's the best lineup you can field, in my opinion.
Yeah, 100% agree. I think some of the questioning here probably comes from the fact that Yelich has talked about not liking to DH. But I think, honestly, at this point in his career, it's just something he's going to have to get used to and kind of get over. It's going to be a big part of his career moving forward, just in terms of, like you mentioned in the question, like trying to keep him healthier, trying to ease him back in, but also, like Jack said, it's the best lineup is when you have him a lot of your better hitters are going to come from the outfield rather than like Eric Haas catching and Contreras DHing or Canha playing first and Hoskins DHing. Most of the time, your best options are going to be the other three outfielders out there with Yelich DHing. So, in that way, it makes sense. In the way of health, it makes sense. I also think Yelich just hasn't gotten used to DHing, and there might be a bit of an adjustment when he has to do it more regularly, but eventually he will find a rhythm where he knows how to kind of find time to stay loose in between at bats, how to do that. I think that's always one of the tougher things. And we should note part of the reason it may have been difficult for him to stay loose between at bats while he was DHing is because his back was probably stiffening up quite a bit when he wasn't moving around. So that could be part of the issue for him too. It might be easier for him to do these things if the back is in a better place. So I agree. I was going to say basically more than 50-50 is what I was going to say. So I agree. 60-40 makes a lot of sense. And he'll play outfield, but I think it's more DH.
I think there's also a distinction to make, or like something to point out, that just because a player says he would rather not do this doesn't mean that he's like fully closed off to doing it if that's what helps the team the most. And my guess is that's almost certainly what this situation is. If you don't, that's fine if you'd rather be in the field. I mean, these guys are competitors. They want to play and contribute in every facet of the game. There's nothing wrong with that. But if he's presented with this and he's told, number one, this just gives us the best lineup. Number two, it's probably best for your health. I don't really see why he'd have any serious opposition to that at that point, even if it's not his preference. So I think that's something important to think of as well. As far as like spring training playing time, my guess is he's probably still going to play mostly outfield in the spring so they have that option. He's prepared for that. They got to see how the back does too, coming off that surgery when he's running around in the outfield as well. So I don't think we're going to, see a lot of games where he's DHing in spring training unless it's like maybe his first game of spring or something if they're trying to ease him back. But I think he'll be in the field a lot in spring, and then they always know they're going to have the DH option. And my guess is if enough people stay healthy, that's probably the way it's going to shake out a little more often than not, but there will still be plenty of outfield time for him as well. Sticking on kind of the outfield picture, Mason asked us, at what point would Sal Frelick's offense have to get to for the Brewers to put Tyler Black in left field and make Frelick a bench player? If Sal's hitting below 250 with a low slugging percentage at the end of May, and Black is hitting well in Nashville, should and would the Brewers make that switch? Given how good Sal has become defensively, I think now you're looking at a pretty low bar.
Yeah.
One that we're probably not going to reach.
Yeah. That's what I was going to say. I think it would have to be a horrific offensive start for them to even start considering something like that. I do think Black could be an okay outfielder. I've said that a number of times, but Sal Frelick won a Gold Glove, and while I don't really care about that, it was a legitimately well-earned Gold Glove. He was a very, very good defensive outfielder last year. And I think he's more likely to be a slightly better offensive player this year than to get worse this year. So I just don't see it happening. I guess in the scenario of should they or would they, if this all happened, I don't think they should, and I don't really think they would, to be honest with you. I think it would be a case where it would have to be much more drastic than the numbers you're laying out, even for it to even become a consideration. And even then, my guess would be is that they would still kind of go with the defense, where at that point, your Blake Perkins is probably back. He's probably just playing more often than Sal. If they do that, you might see Yelich in the outfield a little bit more with more DH spots for, they might work around that. Maybe, Tyler Black might end up DHing a little bit in that scenario or playing a little bit of first or something if that happened. But again, I don't think they would. And I don't think they should if that's kind of the benchmark we're looking at.
Kevin asks, when will the Ryan McMahon deal be completed? So a little bit of context for this one. There was a tweet that went out a couple nights ago from an account that I have never seen before, saying that the Brewers and Rockies have held preliminary discussions regarding a trade that would send third baseman Ryan McMahon to Milwaukee. My approach whenever I see this stuff is if it's not a name I recognize, I just write it off completely usually. Right off the not to discount not to discount that maybe something along those lines did happen, but I'm discounting the fact that whoever this person is, if they even are the person they're claiming to be, actually knows anything. So I don't really pay attention to it. I would not be surprised at all if the Brewers checked in on Ryan McMahon at some point because he's a very Brewersy type player.
Yep.
But when I see something like this doesn't lead me to believe that there's actually something happening here. Maybe there is, maybe there's not, but it's independent of what is almost certainly not a true tweet. I didn't look into the account too much, but I don't. He's got NBA in his social media handle. I know you're more of an NBA follower than I am. Do you have any more context on this? Have you seen this guy before?
I have seen him before. I'll let people make their own decisions on these things, but I'm in the same boat as you. I'm more of a, if it's not Rosenthal, Murray, Jeff Passan, John Heyman, doesn't go too much further than that, other than like team beat writers who would obviously have maybe some, good sources in terms of something that's happening. But otherwise, no, I'll wait until somebody like that says something about it. To that extent, though, I also think we have heard from some of those people that the Rockies, when teams did check in with them, have basically been saying you can pay an arm and a leg or you can't have them. So I think the Brewers probably did check in. It would make, like you said, a ton of sense for them to have checked in. The Rockies are a poorly run organization who don't seem to understand what they are or who they are as a team, or see a chance to maybe actually make a trade that could help them in the future. And it sounds like they're asking for way too much for him. So at that point, the Brewers are not going to be the team to overpay for a Ryan McMahon type of player. I would not expect anything to be happening here unless the Rockies come down from their pretty widely reported high asking price. So I'm not taking much from this one.
Yeah, that's the sticking point for me. The Rockies, for whatever reason, just decide they're not going to trade their best players, even though there's no feasible way they're going to compete unless they completely overhaul their entire leadership structure and player development structure and basically everything throughout their organization. And they're almost certainly doing the same thing here. There were reports at the deadline, like you said, last year that teams wanted Ryan McMahon, and the Rockies either said he's not available or they came back with some sort of outlandish ask that basically said he was unavailable. And the only thing that would change that is if you give us some kind of absurd package in return. So I'm not really reading into this at all. Lucas asked, does it make sense to get Abner Uribe's suspension out of the way to open the season, even if he ultimately just gets optioned back to AAA? I know the guys at the Milwaukee Tailgate podcast talked about this a little bit a few weeks ago, and I would largely agree with what they said. They said there's some merit to this because when you're starting the season, everybody's generally pretty fresher than they're probably going to be at points throughout the season. So I think maybe it could happen. The issue here, I think, that kind of complicates things is there's like no real way to get around it because he's suspended not for days but for games. So you can't even use like the opening weekend built-in off day for that. I don't know. It's just going to be codependent on so many other factors.
Yeah.
It's hard to say.
Yeah. The more I've thought about it, I do think it would make plenty of sense, especially even though that day off doesn't count towards his ability to, or it doesn't count towards his number of days suspended. It does count towards the opening day relievers that are used having an extra day to kind of bounce back for those next 3 games. So in that way, it kind of helps potentially just overall. It may make sense overall just for them to do it then. I also was wondering, and I did not have a chance to look this up, but I don't know if are they able to potentially, have him serve 3 games and then if they need somebody, option him and have him come back and serve that last game of the suspension at a different time? Like, I don't know how that works, if they could start it, use it until they need somebody, and then send him back down. If they can do that, I wouldn't be surprised if they did that just to try and get it out of the way. And if it doesn't work out perfectly, at least shorten the suspension the second time around when he does come back up. But we can look into that and probably give a more firm answer on if that's an actual possibility. But if it is, I think that would maybe be under consideration, and it would probably make it more likely for them to at least try it at the beginning of the year. And then if it doesn't work out completely, then you option them down. I'm not 100% sure on that, though.
My guess is probably not, because you think about it, like when a player is suspended, you don't have the ability to add someone to replace him. And my guess
Right.
is the league would almost certainly view that as that's what you're doing. You're replacing a suspended player by trying to suspend his suspension. Like I it's got to be continuous. I don't see any way there'd be wiggle room there.
Yeah. Makes
So,
sense.
yeah, kind of. It is interesting though, because it's like there's no good time for it, so it's just a matter of when's the time where it hurts you the least. And I do think there's a pretty compelling argument to be made that that first weekend is just the time to do it, because I
Right.
can't really think of another time where you're going to be in that kind of spot.
No. I mean, if you
Are
are, I think you have to wait till the All-Star break. Like that's when you maybe do 2 before and 2 after or something where you get a break in there for
Mhm.
everybody else. Like otherwise I have no idea where you find a good time for that with a reliever.
Right. The only I could think of that, and the only other one I could maybe think of is if they know they have a like there's a rescheduled game and they have a doubleheader coming up where you can add a
Yeah.
27th guy, and you say, "Well, we're actually in a good enough spot pitching wise where we don't necessarily need that 27th guy for the doubleheader, but we can use that to kind of, indirectly be our guy for Abner if he's unavailable." And then you're at least a little covered there. But yeah, that you also can't really plan on that happening. So
No.
I think the only one where, like, for sure there's at least some sort of order around having that guy unavailable probably is opening day, but we'll see how they decide to approach that. Final question we'll take is from Older Potato, who asks, at what point do you think it's wise to trade bullpen help away to try to bolster the bats? It seems like we have a surplus at the moment. So my my cautionary message on this one is relievers do not have nearly the price tag on the trade market that they used to. I think that when you had
Mhm.
that blockbuster 2016 deadline where guys like Andrew Miller and Aroldis Chapman were netting you like massive prospects headlined by guys like Gleyber Torres or guys like Clint Frazier. It's a name that I haven't said in a while, but kind of a throwback there. Those days are gone, though. You're not seeing those kind of moves. Like you think about Chapman was a rental that year for the Cubs. Devin Williams is a rental this year for the Yankees. The Brewers did not get that same kind of package. And Devin Williams, I know he was coming off an injury shortened season, but he's probably the number two reliever in baseball behind Emmanuel Clase. Like arguably even better now than Chapman was at the time that he got dealt with one
Yeah.
not in less than a year of control, like
I was
half
gonna
a
say
year
that
of
was a half
control.
season versus a
And
full.
he still got more. And I get it, it's not apples to apples because it's deadline versus off season, but still,
Mhm.
I think the point stands. I don't think you're getting the bat you're looking for by trading a reliever. I think that's the issue here.
Yeah. Agreed. I think, pen depth is definitely solid, but I don't think even if they did net you like a major league bat, I doubt it's netting you anything that's actually an upgrade over what the Brewers already have on their roster. So you might get an interesting piece if you made a deal. You might find somebody who has something of some sort of talent that you might be able to use. But I doubt you could trade any of the Brewers' current relievers for anybody that would really upgrade the offense to any extent where it would feel worth it to make that deal and potentially kind of worse than a group that is going to be a really big part of the team this year too. I don't know that just not to go on a huge tangent here, but like sometimes I think we think of the roster in terms of like, oh, we have a lot of this position, we need to trade it for this position. And then by May, it's like, oh, all three of the guys that we had as the starters or main people at this position are hurt or underperforming. And now we're really glad we have all of this depth. Like you don't have to trade depth. You don't have to do that. You can keep the guys and just use that as a way to backfill when you do have injuries. And I think the pen is actually the biggest example of that because you're going to have guys who performance fluctuates a ton in the bullpen. So there's going to be guys who were good last year who aren't going to be good this year. That's almost a certainty. You're going to have a lot of injuries. That happens every single year. Like, you want to have this pen depth. You don't really, like, if a perfect trade came around, you would do it, but you're not doing it just because, oh, we have a lot of relievers. We don't really need all those guys. Like, the Brewers purposely have this much depth in their pen. So it's a reasonable question. I don't see a good path to it really upgrading the roster overall. So I don't think we see anything too big come out of that depth.
And with that, we'll wrap up the week with Spencer's minor league sandbox. Not a super long one today, it looks like, but you do have a couple of updates here, so I'll let you take it away.
Oh, we'll see. All right. Well, unfortunately, I do have to start with some bad news that I guess is, to an extent, a little bit of breaking news because it hasn't come out yet, but I'm allowed to talk about it, I asked. One of my underrated arms from last week, of course, is Jason Woodward. I was very excited about him, talked about him quite a bit. Unfortunately, he did undergo his second Tommy John surgery this offseason, pretty shortly after the season, but he is going to miss all of 2025. I'm not going to rehash everything I like about him as a pitcher, but I will say I just feel bad for the dude. He was drafted while he was coming off of Tommy John surgery in 23. He finally got healthy for like the last month of the season where he was able to pitch in games. Last season, he looked really good while he was doing it. And then he left his last appearance with, at the time, an unknown injury. It didn't seem super major, but apparently it was the elbow again. So he underwent his second Tommy John surgery and will miss all of this year. And that's unfortunate because he was one of the guys I was looking forward to seeing, arguably more than almost any other pitcher in the system this year. He really did kind of blow me away with the stuff that I saw in Carolina last year in a small sample. So hopefully, he's doing okay mentally, because this is a tough, like I talked about with Bukauskas, this is a really tough thing to have happen twice in a span of basically 2 calendar years. But otherwise, also hopefully he can just come back and keep showing the same things he was showing prior to this second injury. And there's a very high ceiling there. So hopefully everything goes well with him, but we will not be seeing him in 2025. Then I just want to go through we got some good StatCast data from Sunday's game against Colorado, like Jack talked about. Hardly anything from the Cleveland game because StatCast was not working well during that one, but we did get some good stuff on Sunday from a couple of draftees that we didn't have a ton of data on before. Chandler Welch, drafted out of Tulane. One of the guys who, a bit of a surprise pick, but obviously when the Brewers take a pitcher, you always take note. And as we found out, he's more of a 5-pitch guy. He only threw 4 pitches in this game. He didn't use his changeup, but he does have a changeup as well. He threw more of a, StatCast called it a slider. He calls it a cutter. It is kind of in that iffy range, but I would say it's more of a cutter. He uses it that way. He threw that in the upper 80s. It grades out as a pretty solid pitch. He had a couple swings and misses against it in the game against the Rockies. That's probably his primary pitch, most likely. At the very least, it was in this outing, but I think moving forward too, it's the pitch he's talked about being most comfortable with. He also threw a sweeper, gets quite a bit of movement, high spin pitch. Another pitch that should be able to generate some whiffs. He didn't locate it very well. He was kind of missing to his arm side with it in this game, so it didn't do a ton for him in this one, but I think a pitch that'll be a nice out pitch for him. He throws a 4-seam and a sinker. The 4-seam, in terms of pure shape and movement, doesn't look great. It's only in that 93 range. He's been up to 95 with it before, but it is at negative 4.1 vertical approach angle. That's about where it was when I saw the college data too. So it is one of those pitches that, despite maybe not looking great on the surface, it does come from a pretty low release, like Jack talked about. It's decent spin for a fastball, and then it does play pretty well up in the zone. And then his sinker is another okay, decent offering. When you look at it across the board, there's kind of a Colin Ray type of profile here where it's all 3 fastballs, sweeper, and changeup, and the changeup being the least used of all of them. So I think that's what you're hoping for. I think there's also a chance he ends up a reliever where he kind of cuts down the repertoire, but we will see as he continues through the minors. But exciting to get a little bit of data on him. The second guy that I want to talk about, and the one that was most exciting to see some of the StatCast stuff on for me, was Tyson Harden. He was a day 3 pick out of Mississippi State. The Brewers love their Mississippi State pitchers. This is a guy who, when he was at Mississippi State, when he got there, he was basically just a 4-seam fastball, and then he tried to throw a slider, and it was very bad. He added a decent slider. It was classified as a cutter by StatCast. He calls it a slider. And it was his most often used pitch in college last year, and it was the same in this inning that he threw. Pretty solid pitch, something that is a pretty nice whiff pitch for him. It was in college. He got a good amount of whiffs in this short 1-inning appearance. His 4-seam has, we talked about vertical approach angle a lot today, negative 3.6, which is pretty nuts. He comes from a 5.2. His release height is 5.2 feet, which is low. It's similar to Henderson and Welch. And another one where it's like shape-wise on the surface, maybe not crazy good, but almost 15 inches of induced vertical break with 2,500 RPMs coming from that low release. I think it's a pitch that'll play pretty well for him, and he can get he was up to 98 in college a couple of times, sits in that like 95, 96 range with it. The thing that jumped out to me, though, was that he threw 3 other pitches in this outing. He threw 3 changeups, which actually I wouldn't say a great pitch, but he takes a decent amount of velocity off of it, and he gets a lot of run, which the rest of his stuff doesn't have a ton of run except for the one sinker that he threw, which again, another new pitch for him, something he had not thrown in college. And then he also mixed in a curveball, which was around 80 miles per hour. And the big thing for me here is that it gives him a much wider velocity band. I talk about that sometimes, where he's got the 4-seam that can get into the upper 90s. He's got the cutter/slider that's in the upper 80s. And then he's got a pitch that gets down into the low 80s. I like that. I wonder, to me, this kind of points to them potentially making him a starter, which I hadn't been considering. I thought he might be a fast-moving reliever in the system, but he throws a bunch of different pitches now. The curveball looks pretty decent to me. I don't know about the sinker, but the Brewers we know that the Brewers like having as many fastballs as they possibly can. And the changeup's not too bad either. So it was an interesting, more than anything else, it was just interesting to me to see him throwing a bunch of different pitches, because he did not do that at all in college. He was a 1 to 2 pitch guy. And then there were a couple pitchers I just want to point out in the Tuesday game. I'm not going to go through everything that they did. We didn't get good StatCast data, so I can't really do that anyway. But it was fun to watch the group of relievers they brought in, because Nick Merkel, who was an undrafted free agent out of an NAIA school, came in. He only threw 6 pitches, or I shouldn't say that. He throws 6 pitches, and all of them are pretty decent, borderline average or a little bit better. He's got all 3 fastballs. He struck out Stephen Kwan, and the only batter that he faced today, with a cutter. And Kwan kind of gave him like a nod of approval, which I think everyone knows Kwan's a pretty tough guy to strike out in general, and he kind of looked surprised by the late break on the cutter. He also throws a slider and a curveball and a changeup. I would say all 3 of the secondaries are probably above average pitches. The fastballs are all they're okay. But they play off of each other well, and he's a guy that I've just enjoyed watching a lot in Double-A. We got some Arizona Fall League data on him, and it made me more excited for him. Huge extension. He's a huge guy. He's 6'5", 255 pounds. His nickname is Large Mammal. Super fun guy. So I was excited to see him, but that was an undrafted free agent. The next pitcher, Will Childers, another undrafted free agent. He got up to 97, showed some nice breaking balls. Jack Hostetler, an undrafted free agent out of a D3 school last year. He was up to 97 on his 4-seam with 16 inches of induced vertical break. He also threw a sinker and a cutter. I think he threw a breaking ball, but StatCast didn't show it. I think it was a slower pitch, but StatCast, of course, did not read that one. But he was actually committed to transfer to Oregon State from the D3 he was at. So this is a pretty exciting arm to get as an undrafted free agent. And then the next guy that pitched was an indie ball guy, Ryan Sandberg, not related to the Hall of Famer. But he showed 2 interesting breaking balls. He walked a few guys, and the fastball velo was a lot lower than I was expecting it to be. I had heard he was more like 93 to 95, and he basically was 90 on everyone that StatCast read. So maybe a little bit of nerves for a guy who hadn't actually pitched in a professional game. He just got signed out of indie ball this year and then jumped into a major league spring training game. But I think it's just cool to see how many different ways the Brewers find pitching. And I was texting earlier with someone, and we were like, it's not out of the realm of possibility that someday the Brewers form an entire bullpen of undrafted or indie ball guys. And they almost seem to be trying to do that with some of the stuff they do. But D3 guy, NAIA, bunch of undrafteds, indie ball guys, like the Brewers explore all of these different ways to find players. And as we saw, all of them have pretty interesting stuff. I mean, if you're hitting 97 with multiple pitches, you're always going to have at least a bit of a shot. So finishing off here, I told Jack it was probably going to be longer than he anticipated, and I'm certain he's thinking that right now. But finishing off with my underrated players, I told you guys I was going to get a hitter in here. I've got one hitter. Starting with him, it is Handel Fry Encarnacion. First of all, awesome name. Really rooting for him to get there just for that reason. But at the same time, he's a very interesting guy that I probably have ranked higher than, well, I don't think many people rank as many people as I do anyway, but just consensus in terms of where I see him in the system. I think he's a lot more interesting than people maybe give him credit for. He was injured after 3 games last year. He missed basically a full month after that. He returned, bit of a slow start. And then the last month of his season, he just mashed. He had a 151 WRC plus. He was putting up exit velocities of, I've seen video of it up to at least 107 as a 17-year-old. So there's big pop here. He hits the ball in the air a lot. He hits the ball to the pull side a lot. He only hit 2 homers last year, but I think there's going to be home run power coming for him. Some decent speed, good arm, somebody who can handle all 3 outfield spots, but probably ends up in a corner. But overall, just an interesting dude. And then on the pitching side of things, I'm going to go with another guy who spent some time in the DSL last year, Wandy Torres. I think there's a pretty good chance he starts in Carolina this year. But it's a big lefty, 6'3", over 200 pounds already. He's been up to 98. He sits in the mid-90s. Pretty nice looking slider. He throws a changeup. I think that's a pretty distant third pitch for him right now. But for his size and age, super like easy looking left-handed delivery. In the DSL last year, he struck out 53.23% of hitters he faced. He only walked 9.68%. His ERA was unsurprisingly 1.72. Now, this was only in 15 2/3 innings, but a strikeout to walk rate of 43.55% would have led everybody at every level, no matter how many innings you threw. I checked for 10 innings minimum, and he was leading the DSL, the ACL, any inning, any level you could find in terms of strikeout to walk ratio. So really, really good stuff from a big lefty who had really good results last year. I don't think many people have ever heard his name, probably. He hasn't really gotten much attention. The Brewers did post a little video of him on their Brewers PD account during the season last year, but he's somebody I'm going to be keeping a very close eye on. Like I said, I think he's going to be at Carolina to start the year. I don't think the stuff has any reason to stop in the complex league. He should probably just be pitching against full season guys right away, and we'll see how he holds up there. But this is one of the more exciting arms, I think, just overall in the system, because lefties who throw upper 90s are always going to be in high demand. So, yeah, very excited to watch him. And yeah, those are my 2. I got a hitter in, I got a pitcher in. I unfortunately had some bad news on another pitcher that I was very excited about. But yeah, this was hopefully this is more detail. I've been trying to get to more detail. I got more StatCast stuff to talk about now. I probably won't make them all this long now. I'm going to find that happy medium between where I've been and where I went today. But we'll try and keep this going. And yeah, as we get into the minor league season, it'll be even easier for me to bring at least something to the table every week. So yeah.
No wonder that took longer than I thought it was going to, because you have a separate page of notes from our own outline that I can't see.
Yeah.
What the hell?
Well, it's easier for me to read it and organize it on there. So
all right. You would just think you could keep your podcast co-host in on what's going on just for planning purposes, but I guess that's too much to ask.
Yes, it is. No apologies. I won't.
On that note, I will spend the time between this episode and our next one fuming at Spencer for how he structured the minor league sandbox behind my back, but I'm sure it'll happen more in the future. So thank you all for listening, and it'll be a little bit over a week for us because we had to shift the schedule around a little bit here. But you can now expect to hear from us next week, Friday. We'll get back on the usual release schedule as the Brewers continue building up for the start of the regular season, which is basically about a month out now. So regular season baseball getting ever closer by the day. Thank you all for listening. This is the Brewer Fanatic Podcast.